Call Shane Ritty.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak to this bill, the Outer Space and High Altitude Activities Bill. This bill does indeed allow an exciting new industry to form in New Zealand and takes advantage of some of our competitive opportunities and attributes that we have. It's already been mentioned, our relatively remote isolation. We also have a low volume of marine and air traffic, and we have a range of orbital inclinations that we can use. Now, this bill joins several other space treaties that New Zealand is already a party to, including the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States and the Explorations and Use of Outer Space, the Agreement on the Rescue of Astronauts, and the Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by Space Objects. We're also looking to be a party to a newer treaty, the Convention on Regulation of Objects launched into outer space, and fundamentally this talks about requirements to register objects in space. This bill has been guided in its formation by UN Resolution 6874. The name of that is the Recommendations on National Legislation Relevant to the Peaceful Exploration and Use of Outer Space. And our drafters have taken heed of this and the 8 guiding principles that UN Resolution has. They include the scope of such national legislation, that a country should be responsible, should have national jurisdiction for all objects that are launched into space from its land. Authorisation, space activities should be authorised. Authorisation should be consistent with UN treaties. A national registry of objects, recourse and liability to operations, and the transfer of ownership and responsibility when objects in space similarly transfer. And we can see the formation of this bill takes many of these into account, and where it doesn't, the treaties we're a partner to certainly does. Fundamentally, this bill is concerned with launch facilities, space vehicles, payload and high altitude travel, and it defines a number of compulsory conditions which actually cover right across the launch vehicle with a launch licence and to the payload with the payload permit. Those compulsory conditions include knowledge of the date, location and the intended trajectory of the launch vehicle and the payload, basic orbital parameters, coordination of radio communication frequencies consistent with the ITU, a payload permit. You must minimise the risk of contamination of outer space or adverse changes to the Earth's environment, and take into account other users of outer space. Finally, the launch vehicle and the payload must be consistent with Civil Aviation Authority and our international obligations. Mr Speaker, our national security interests are also taken into account by requiring the responsible minister to consult security ministers. This is a well thought out bill, Mr Speaker, and it's with pleasure that we look forward to receiving it in Select Committee, and I commend it to the House.